Blowback. These days, it seems to be the one unifying theme driving much of the United States foreign policy in the Arab world. It's also the theme for this week's episode of The Point. Stay tuned. Welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian. The military-industrial complex, it seems like we're constantly fighting this perpetual war on terror. And why is that? Well, when you take a look at who's benefiting from these wars, I think you guys get the picture. So that's what we're going to talk about on today's show. We're going to talk about why we're fighting this war on terror and whether or not it's an ethical war to fight. But to break that up into three different segments, we're first going to talk about the current situation in Mali and Algeria. As you guys know, Islamic militants have taken over the northern part of Mali, so we'll discuss that a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the U.S. drone program, something that has really violated civil liberties in our country and abroad. And finally, we're going to talk about torture practices that were depicted in the recent film Zero Dark 30. But before we get to all of that, let's meet our experts, let's meet our panelists, and I want to thank all of you guys for being here today. I'm really looking forward to having a great discussion about this. Cameron White served 2 tours of duty as a member of the United States Marine Corps. Before becoming an anti-war activist, he is now the Los Angeles chapter president of Iraq Veterans Against the War. He currently works in the California Community College system, helping veterans and low-income and minority students gain access to higher education, and is the creative director of the National Veterans Foundation. Cameron, thank you so much.
I'm glad to be here.
All right. Curt Schlichter is a conservative comedian and columnist whose work appears at Breitbart.com, Townhall.com, and has been featured in the New York Post, Washington Examiner, and the Los Angeles Times. Curt is a veteran of the Persian Gulf War and Operation Enduring Freedom in Kosovo. He's also the author of the ebook, I Am a Conservative, Uncensored, Undiluted, and Absolutely Un-PC. Curt, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for welcoming me to this den of leftist iniquity. You guys have been very well organized for liberals.
Just to put you at ease, I read your blog on Breitbart about Lena Dunham, and I hated it. So I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of great things to discuss on today's show. It's going to be great. And then finally, last but not least, Ilona Minkovski, who is well known to the TYT fans as the former host of RT's network's The Ilona Show, and is currently a host and producer for Huffpost Live. Most notably, she's also both a previous panelist and point contributor to this esteemed program. And it's her birthday today, so happy birthday, Ilona. Yeah!
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
So let's get right to it. I want to start off by talking about the situation in Mali. And our first point comes from Ed Krayewski, and he's from Reason Magazine. He's going to talk about the situation. Let's take a look.
Hi, my name is Ed Krayewski, and I'm an associate editor at Reason.com 24/7. And my point is that the present Western intervention in Mali is an unintended, but not completely unforeseen, consequence of the previous Western intervention in Libya. As we all know, in 2011, U.S.-French coalition entered the Libyan civil war to help topple Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. At the time, counterterrorism experts warned that Islamist militants were involved in the uprising against Colonel Gaddafi, and that Gaddafi was in control of weapons that would easily go missing if in the instability that would follow his overthrow. Indeed, when Colonel Gaddafi was overthrown, was finally toppled, killed, up to 20,000 weapons went missing, and many of them were still missing, as we found out in hearings after the terrorist attack on Benghazi last September, which may also be linked to militants who were on the side of the rebels in Libya that the U.S. and France and the West backed. As recently as 2011, USAID, an American agency, called Mali one of the most enlightened democracies in 21st century Africa. Yet today, the French have entered to help the armed forces run by a coup leader to push out militants that have overrun the north. What happened? Well, the Tuareg, who were allied with Gaddafi, entered Mali after the toppling of the Gaddafi regime and helped to overrun the north with Islamists all the way to Timbuktu. And eventually, in fact, the Tuareg, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, went over and is now fighting with the French. So I think that's kind of emblematic of what can happen with these short-sighted interventions, of not asking what's the intent here and what might happen, but simply saying we're going to do it because we can, and what difference does it make? So that's my point, and I'm an associate editor at Reason.com 24/7. That's Reason.com/24-7. Thanks.
All right, so Curt, I actually want to start off with you. Do you agree with what Ed says in that video? Do you believe that this is blowback from our intervention in Libya?
Well, I think it is and it isn't. What we're looking at here is a major strategic problem. It is not just an individual fight in Libya or an individual fight in Mali. The problem of radical Islam and jihadi terrorism is a worldwide problem. It's not simply Libya. And the fact is, when you stomp on it in one place, the cockroaches skitter out and they go to other places. The problem with the current strategy, or what's passing for a strategy, because I don't think it really is one, is it's basically a series of conflicts. We fight here, we'll fight here, we'll fight there. That's not the way to do it. We need a comprehensive strategy so that when you end a problem in one place, it doesn't give rise to a problem in another place. Plus, I don't see us using fully all our means of national power. Yeah, the military one is an important one. It's a vital one. It is a necessary one. But what about economic power? What about diplomatic power? What about information power? We're falling down in all those categories. Look, I served a long time in the military. I certainly understand and support military force against Islamic terrorists. I strongly support it. But that's not a strategy, that's a tactic. We need a strategy that comprehensively addresses the problem. And until then, it's just going to spread. Considering
the massive amount of money that we're spending on defense and our current economic situation, do you really believe that it makes sense to take the lead on fighting so-called terrorism abroad? And what would that comprehensive plan be? Well, first of all, the basic point of the federal government is to defend the United States. So as far as I'm concerned, you spend what you need to do that, and the rest of it for social programs and everything else, those are extras. The Constitution exists for one purpose, to defend our people. And if fighting these Islamic terrorists is what we need to do, and I believe it is, then we do that first and we spend as much money as we need to do it. Not saying there's not waste in the military department. There certainly is. However, the concept, that should be our priority as a government. However, it doesn't mean we can't use other factors. Diplomatic, information, economic. Let's get Ilona into this conversation, because I'm really curious to see what you think. Do you believe that we need a comprehensive plan to fight terrorism abroad, and do you feel like the U.S. is really facing another terrorist threat?
I'm not really sure what we would call a comprehensive plan at this point after 11 years of trying to fight a global war on terror. You know, comprehensive would mean that we actually look back at some of our tactics and some of the blowback and realize that parts of our strategy are actually having the opposite effect. Like you said, you want to say the cockroaches will spread. Well, this is what's going on right now. We're creating more terrorists because of some of the tactics that we're using. And I mean, if you want to talk about these interventions abroad too, I think Mali is an interesting situation because it looks like maybe the U.S. is learning a bit of a lesson in that they don't want to be the first one, you know, to actually send troops in. They're letting the French do it. We are actually offering a lot of intelligence to the French. We're offering them certain equipment, air tankers, so they can refuel. And these are just the gradual steps. And I think that's the best policy for the United States to take. But again, this goes back to Libya, where we really did lead the charge, where you had the president get us into this conflict without ever asking Congress for any kind of approval. And so now you're seeing the repercussions of that. So what's the point of fighting this global war on terrorism, you know, when it seems like we're just making it worse? I don't really know what the answer is, other than to maybe have you know, have a moment to really think back on what we've done and look at the effects of it and look at the results, which is just to make it a worse thing. I'm sorry, I'm not putting this argument together all that well at the moment, but you know, you also have to talk about whether or not we're missing other threats, whether we're just fighting yesterday's war. This is a you know, critique that's always handed down at our military-industrial complex. And so great, we spent 11 years fighting terrorists, which, by the way, I mean, the statistics, the probability of you dying in a terrorist attack are so much lower than any other daily occurrence in life, like driving a car, getting into a car accident. So why does this have to be a strategy or, you know, national security threat number one? Wouldn't you argue that occupying a country for more than a decade would probably cause more hostility toward the United States as opposed to fighting the so-called terrorists? I mean, that's the real question here. I feel like
our actions abroad have made us look like the terrorists. You know, when you're doing the drone strikes, which we will talk about in the next segment, when you're doing indefinite detention, you know, Gitmo, there are so many numerous aspects of this so-called war on terror that makes the U.S. look bad and makes people hostile toward us. I mean, Cameron, tell me what you think. You know, I want you to share your unbiased opinion.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. I don't think that military intervention is a kind of foreign policy to combat things like terrorism, because terrorism sort of becomes like a cyclical and a cultural thing in the sense of how we make enemies in the long term. When you've been in a country for 10 years or more, there's generations of kids that are growing up within that war zone, and they're seeing the United States as the enemy. To go back to the point that Ed made, that I do think that the result of Mali is a fallout from Libya, and the United States has this tendency in its foreign policy to be very short-sighted, to not take into account, as we saw with the Iraq War that we had supposedly won when Bush landed on the aircraft carrier and declared victory and all that. And,
mission accomplished.
Yeah, mission accomplished, and we stayed there for, I mean, we still have a presence there. I just think that the United States sort of has this policy, I mean, it's very economically charged. You can see the economic connection to the Iraq War, you can see the economic connection to Libya, and I think that's why we don't have direct military intervention in Mali right now, because we don't see economically how it serves us.
Curt, what do you have to say about that?
Well, look, I don't, I don't think we're deciding where to go fight in Mali or not fight in Mali based on Mali's massive resources.
Well, Mali, I mean, why did we invade Iraq? Realistically, did Iraq really pose a threat to national security?
Well, remember, I was in Iraq, the Iraq War round one, and I was quite glad that at the time I didn't have to lead my guys north into Baghdad. I kind of wish we had at the time back in the early 90s. The fact is, we won the Iraq War. You look at Iraq now, it is something that's passably like a democracy, passably stable. Sure, there's still terrorists running around. But this is important. The mere fact that because you occupy a place and assist the lawful government in a counterinsurgency operation does not necessarily turn the population against you. I think the population of Iraq is probably very happy that we're gone and happy to be run by Iraqis again. However, the mere fact that we choose that tactic doesn't necessarily lead to our defeat. And we have to understand something else. This is not a war on terror. Yes, I know George Bush called it a war on terror, but I think that was imprecise. And I think that was a poor choice of terms. Terror is a tactic. It's not a strategy. It's not an overarching goal. The overarching goal of radical Islamists is to impose radical Islam on everyone they can. And they're doing that in Egypt. They're trying to do that in Libya. They're trying to do that in Syria. It is a strategy, and we need to address it as a strategy that's worldwide. They are serious about what they believe. Whether we kill them with drones or kill them with bayonets doesn't really matter. They're going to hate us just the same. So I think the idea of focusing on our tactics as spurring them to more action, I don't really think it does. In fact, I think the louder they yell is really an indicator of how effective our tactics are.
So what should our role in Mali be? I know Ilona said that what we're doing now, which is basically very, very little, is the right way to go. But considering our actions in Libya spurred what's happening now in Mali, do you feel that the U.S. should get involved?
Well, I don't feel our actions in Libya spurred what's happening in Mali. Mali was going to do, the radical Islamists were going to do in North Africa what they're doing all over North Africa, and they're going to do that in Mali too. What we're doing now is something that I think is long overdue, and that's letting our European allies pick up a freaking rifle and take charge. Since World War II, we have been covering Western Europe. I know, I was in the Cold War. I stood in Germany, and I was there prepared to die fighting Russians right at the border. The fact is that for way too long, we have let the Europeans get away with spending all their money on their useless social programs and us picking up the tab for their defense, okay? It's time they did it themselves. Mali is just as much Europe's problem as it is ours. Let them take the lead for once.
So you think
go ahead.
Let me just make a quick point about the social programs. I think that it's ridiculous that a country should focus most of its funding, most of its federal funding on so-called defense, on trying to spread their so-called democracy to another country while ignoring and neglecting their own citizens. When I pay taxes, I'm not interested in my tax money going toward drone strikes or killing innocent civilians abroad. I'm interested in helping my people and giving back to my country. So the whole social programs, who cares about that? Let's just screw over our own citizens and focus on killing others abroad because private contractors are making a ton of money off of that. I'm 100% against that. I'm sorry, you definitely hit a nerve a little bit there, but Ilona, go ahead and clarify.
I think that's a good point, but I just want to clarify, you said that I said that it's the best thing that the U.S. can do in terms of what's happening in Mali right now with the French intervention is just provide intelligence. I only say that because the situation is already happening. In general, I don't think that we should be getting involved in these interventions at all, and I think that it sets a bad precedent because if you look at Africa and what's happening there, we're now involving ourselves in local conflicts, in ethnic conflicts, and what this does is set a precedent to where if something else goes wrong, well, guess what? The Americans are starting to build up drone bases. What did we learn this week? There's going to be another one, probably in Niger. We've got one in Djibouti, that we have 3,000 troops there already. So that's going to be the go-to is, well, we've got a conflict going on. Let's call up the Americans. Let's call up the Europeans and have them insert themselves and try to solve it. And I think that that's bad strategy and that's bad precedent setting all around because it's not in our direct national security interest to do that. Maybe interests, in another form, be they economic, be they something that that has to do with resources, but it doesn't deal with our national security. And then to go back to your other point that you were making too, I just watched Dirty Wars, Jeremy Scahill's documentary recently, and by the way, it's really good, and I highly recommend that everyone see it. But there's one point that was the strongest to me, where they're kind of interweaving a speech that the president was giving, and they're looking at some of the things that Anwar al-Awlaki had put out on the internet, and this is a very unpopular point to make, but I thought that it was very poignant. And when you look at the language there, you have both people talking about the necessity, right? We need to act now. We have no choice but to act. And there you really do see kind of an intersection, and you have to start asking who's right. Are we actually saying the same thing? If drone strikes are killing innocent civilians and that makes people want to take up arms in retaliation because it's revenge, because they feel that people were wronged and wrongly murdered, we're doing the exact same thing by trying to seek that same kind of revenge, and then that also has repercussions. And so it's still an emotional reaction that's ideologically based on both sides. I'm not by any means defending jihadists here, but I'm saying that we have to be able to be realistic and and acknowledge that.
Look, the situation in Mali is definitely a tough one. There's no question about it. You read numerous articles about what these extremists are doing in that country, whether it's amputations, whether it's just murdering women for talking to other men, like just the most hideous things you could imagine. And as you read it, you think of fighting terror as a so-called noble cause, right? You're thinking we want to help these individuals out. But when you look at the past and you look at our intervention in other countries, it hasn't solved anything when it comes to global terror. You still see the terrorists. And I emailed Glenn Greenwald about this because I feel like he has done a great job at covering these stories and really taking a look at what's going on abroad. And I told him, I was like, Glenn, what do? Do you really just leave it alone? Because he is not in favor of any type of intervention. And I think his answer was great. I wanted to read it for you guys. He says, the problem is nations don't deploy their military for humanistic goals. Militaries are instruments of destruction, not construction. More harm than good is almost always done, even by the most noble interventions. So Kirk, do you have a response to that at all?
Well, I happen to serve in Kosovo, a land dotted with the mass graves of neighbors killed by their neighbors because their religion was different or their ethnicity was different. And I remember the love of the Kosovo people. I've never been loved so much in my life as an American soldier because they were happy because we went there. And there's nothing in Kosovo that we want. There's nothing in Kosovo anybody except the Serbs want. And yet we went there and we put our lives on the line and we put our treasure on the line. And for what? Yeah, there was some war on terror aspects, but the real reason we were there was to maintain peace and help create a democracy. And we did that. And we did that. So the idea that you can never use military force in a positive way is just factually incorrect. It is just wrong. That is not to say it's the only way to do something. That's not to say it's the best way to do something. We need a very clear eye. Look, we have to look at our goal. Our goal overall needs to be defeating the radical Islamic threat. And if it means fighting, it means fighting. If it means killing some of them, it means killing some of them. If it means doing other things, using other powers that we wield as a society, including cultural ones, then we should.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm genuinely curious to see what you have to say about it. What did you think about the Bush administration lying about weapons of mass destruction so we can invade Iraq the second time?
Well, I don't believe they were lying. I believe that, first of all, Saddam Hussein had a considerable infrastructure that was capable of doing it. However, and I believe their best intelligence told them that there were weapons of mass destruction. That aside, I just don't care. Saddam Hussein was an enemy of the United States. He was a festering sore. He murdered his own people. We went in, we cleaned him out, and he got hanged. Good. I'm happy.
You just don't care? What about all the American lives that were lost, coalition forces? What about civilians who lost their lives that were displaced?
And setting the precedent of preemptive strikes.
The precedent preemptive strikes. The precedent for everything that's happened in any of the wars the last 10 years was set 5,000 years ago. This is nothing, what's happening now is nothing new, and what's happening now will never really change. Force will always be a tool among nations, whether it's wielded for good or for evil. I believe in Iraq we wielded it for good. Yes, it had a high cost. Yes, it could have been planned and executed better, and nobody is more on top of that than people within the military establishment.
I'm going to say that I think that absolutely that we knew that there was no weapons of mass destruction. I mean, having been part of that war and part of that invasion, I believe wholeheartedly that I did 2 tours in Iraq. I believe that was completely an economically based war. It was known that Saddam Hussein had been planning on switching the oil currency to trading in euro dollars, which would have greatly undermined the United States, and if he could have gotten other OPEC nations on board with that. The same thing happened in Libya, which is what I believe why our main goal for intervention in Libya was Muammar Gaddafi was talking about switching to a gold dinar and bringing the OPEC nations in on that. And he had conferences about it in 1996, he had conferences about it in the year 2000. And you know, when we see an economic threat like that, because going back to the Bretton Woods Act, when we effectively established the U.S. dollar as the trade currency of the entire world, you know, over the years that policy got undermined up into the Nixon administration when he took us off of the gold standard and switched us to a reserve fiat currency. I think when you pay attention to history, you see why these interventions are happening, and they're mostly economically based, which is why, again, I don't think that we're paying much attention to Mali, because where's our economic payoff? Mali's biggest trade partner is China, it's not us.
All right, I unfortunately have to wrap up this segment. The producer is in the back doing this, like wrap up. But I love that discussion, but we have more to come. We're going to talk about the U.S. drone program and whether or not it's ethical. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Point. For our next point, we are going to evaluate the effectiveness of drone warfare. And to talk to us about that is civil rights attorney and author Chase Madar. Let's see what he has to say.
Hi, my name is Chase Madar. I'm an attorney and the author of The Passion of Bradley Manning, the story behind the WikiLeaks whistleblower. Today we're going to talk a little bit about drones. As you may know, there is an endless legal debate about the lawfulness of drone strikes. But my point today is about something much more fundamental. Are drone strikes, in fact, good U.S. defense strategy? Do they even make us safer here in the United States? Now, our lethal and increasingly frequent use of drones in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and elsewhere carry a very heavy strategic cost to American security here in the homeland. We know that at least 2 out of the most serious terrorist attempts on American soil in the past few years have been motivated in part by drone strikes abroad. How do we know this? Because the terrorists have openly told the judges this at their arraignments and in trials, and it's been widely reported. And yet, American foreign policy elites generally go out of their way to ignore the security costs of our drone strikes abroad. Case in point of this is a brand new report by the American Security Project, a Washington defense think tank. And the name of the report is Understanding the Strategic Considerations of Drone Strikes. Now, nowhere does this new report mention that Fazil Shahzad, the guy who attempted to blow up Times Square in 2010, openly told the judge in court that he did what he did to avenge American drone strikes in his native Pakistan. Nowhere does this new report mention that the 2009 Underpants bombing attempt to bring down a jetliner, a plot hatched in Yemen, came just weeks after U.S. drone strikes killed 50 innocent civilians in Yemen. Terrorist blowback is something real, and we need to take a much harder look at the security costs of drone strikes. If we do so, I think we'll find that apart from killing far too many foreign civilians, drone strikes are terrible for real American security. My name is Chase Madar. That is my point.
All right, Chase Madar made his point very clear. And I always find it interesting when we say we're fighting terror abroad when we're acting as terrorists ourselves. Ilona, what are your thoughts on drone strikes? Do you think that it's possible, some of the attacks or attempted attacks on us are possible blowback from the drone strikes that we're doing?
Oh, I could talk about drone strikes for days. Well, I don't think that it's even, is that a possibility? As Chase pointed out right there, we have heard people say this themselves. It's coming from the source, and so there's not even really a question there. But I think that he wants to separate it from legality to just talk about security, and then of course there's the morality of it. Is this even an ethical practice? I don't think that we can separate any of those things. I think that we have to look at it as a comprehensive package, and if drones are here to stay, then we need to, which they are. I mean, let's face it, right? The technology is here. We're using it. Other countries are using it. Even if, for now, most other people just have surveillance drones, they're going to start arming them, and it's not going to be the United States that's the only one that really uses them to carry out strikes anymore. And so they're here to stay, so we really need to ask a lot of questions. And I think that there are so many issues involved, but I think that the media plays a large role here, too, and that they are selective and that they're lazy. For example, a lot of this information is out there. You have reports of a drone strike landed here, but nobody wants to put together the pieces to really try to see if there are patterns that then emerge after that. Whether a strike hit here and then you might see more of a swell of people taking up arms against the United States because of civilians that were killed in a village here. And when they are covered, it's in a very positive light, right? It's usually like, hey, we got the new #2, and sure, there'll be another one tomorrow, but nobody talk about that because today we killed a terrorist. And at the same time, we're focusing it too much on the people that are involved with having some of these powers. I think that this is why we're not really thinking about strategically whether or not this is something that's going to benefit us in the future or just have blowback. If you look at the way that the New York Times and the Washington Post wants to cover the kill list, the way they want to cover the disposition matrix or the drone rule book that the Obama administration is trying to draw up. It's all focused on the individual who has this power in their hands, on Obama. And because we think of him as a moral leader, then it's probably okay, right? Or John Brennan, who is supposedly fighting to have the CIA focus less on doing drones and being a paramilitary force and going back to being a spy shop so there can be more accountability, and it's brought back to the military. But we have to think about the precedents that we're setting. Again, I keep repeating this, rather than just who's carrying out the drone strikes. And so if this man says that this policy is working, then we think it's okay because we trust him.
All right, well, Curt, I'm really interested to see what you have to say about drone strikes, so go ahead.
Well, let's just say I disagree with Ilona from her premises up. Tactically, morally, and legally, the drone program is absolutely moral. It is absolutely tactically effective, and legally absolutely fine.
You know that we carry out signature strikes where we don't really know who we're targeting, and oftentimes we kill innocent civilians. You think that's moral?
I think it is moral to kill your enemies and those who cleave unto them.
But they're not our enemies. They're innocent civilians.
They are our
So
enemies.
you think 8-year-old children
that just happens to be in the wrong place at the right time is automatically an enemy
Sometimes it's not even a military age male. Sometimes it's an 8-year-old.
There's this thing going on. It's called a war. and they started it, and we need to finish it. Collateral damage, and what a terrible
when did we declare
word.
War, like on Syria? When did we declare war?
Well, we haven't declared war on Syria, but the Congress has authorized us to take action necessary to respond to the threat of Islamic terrorists.
No, but that's not true, because
no, that is true. No, that is a fact. It was voted for.
A lot of
Hillary
these drone
Clinton voted
strikes
for it.
are arbitrarily ordered by the president. There's no congressional.
He doesn't. Congress doesn't have to oversee every tactical operation. Now, I do agree with this. Drones is not a strategy. It is a tactic. It is one thing to do. If it becomes your entire strategy, and I think in some ways, in some places, it is becoming an entire strategy, then you have a problem. It's not a moral problem. It's not a legal problem. It's a warfighting problem. Is that the best way to get the result we need? I want to defeat radical Islam. I want to stop it from being a force that threatens my country. I want to do it in other countries.
How is it threatening your country? I mean,
well, I don't know.
Let's
discuss it at the top of the World Trade Center.
Let's discuss. By the way, the attacks that are happening on the United States, or the attempted attacks on the United States, as was so eloquently pointed in our point, is the fact that we are terrorizing other people abroad.
Well,
the fact that we are killing innocent civilians in our so-called effort to fight this so-called war on terror.
Well, what was the excuse for 9/11? Because there's always an excuse. And they all stink. It doesn't matter. I don't care what the guy sitting in front of the federal judge in the Southern District in New York says as he's being sentenced to 40 years for trying to take out Times Square. I don't care what he says, because what he's going to do is he's going to try and get people who are nice people, but they are wrong, to attempt to stop one of our most effective tactics. And he does that by saying, I wouldn't have done it but for the drone strikes. That is an information operation. It is propaganda. It is a lie. If it wasn't the drone strike, it will be because we like Israel, or because we let women walk around shamelessly without veils, or some other nonsense. It is an information operation.
What would your reaction be? What would your reaction be if officials from another country did a drone strike on U.S. citizens, and they did so because they don't like our ideology, and innocent civilians die as a result of that?
I may or may not be very, very unhappy. I may even recommend a military response. Simply because other people might do what we do doesn't change what we do.
Do you believe in
That's the whole point of thinking about what you do and the ramifications that there might be for that.
Look, you guys are confusing tactics with the overall ideology. The United States Army generally uses the same tactics that Aaron Rommel of the Nazis used when you're moving around forces. Now, but to say that, well, you're the equivalent of Nazis because you employ infantry in a similar manner, that doesn't make any sense. When bad people use drones, it's a bad thing. When the United States uses drones properly and wisely, it's a good thing.
Well, but the question is, what is proper? And Joe Wolverton, I read an article that he wrote recently that was about the drone strikes and our policy, and I thought it was interesting that he even tied the history back to like the Magna Carta, sort of detailing how within Western philosophy and our systems of government and such, due process has always sort of been this thing that is missing from these drone strikes, is that there's no due process.
So let's
discuss. These drone strikes, the question that he posed was, where's the constitutional authority for creating and issuing these kill orders? And I think that's a very pertinent question that we all need to be asking, especially when more information is coming about Obama and these lists, as you mentioned, that sometimes we don't even know if the operatives are the people that we're going after, and there's a lot of civilian casualties because of, basically oversight and effectively people not caring.
But Curt just showed exactly what is wrong with our entire approach to this, which is saying that when we do it, it's okay and it's a good thing, and if anyone else does it, then it's a bad thing. This is what pisses people off all over the world, is that it's always okay if we do it, and if there is some kind of collateral damage involved because it's America that's carrying out, whatever policy it might be, whatever it might be after drones. That is the exact problem, and we're not going to like it when other people start using drones and saying that they want to carry out a signature strike in New York City because there's someone that they think is a bad guy there. So this is, I can't even wrap my mind around that argument.
The fact is, they aren't going to do a signature strike in New York because A, we're not harboring terrorists in New York, and if there were, we'd send the FBI and go get them. And B, nobody else is willing to risk the consequences of the United States having launched an attack in the United States.
How do we know that? Well, if we think they're not willing to risk it, then why do we think that they're such a big threat? And you know, right now, sure, maybe it's only Israel and Saudi Arabia that has armed drones, but like I said, everyone else is going to want this technology.
And if you're going to give them credit for 9/11, then who's to say that they wouldn't carry out an attack?
If the ideology is so strong, then they're not worried about any kind of blowback or repercussions, right?
Remote control plane.
Everybody, look, eventually somebody is going to use drones against us. They're going to use every kind of technology against us. It's going to happen. They're going to embrace a powerful technology that allows you to conduct combat operations in an unprecedented way. And these are combat operations. All the talk about due process is nonsense.
It's not nonsense, especially when it has to do with a U.S. citizen, and there's a lack of transparency as to why the Obama administration...
I understand your concerns in principle. In practice, I think we're talking about, what, a Lockheed?
So you're saying that we should just override the Constitution?
Absolutely not.
And his 16-year-old son,
Absolutely not.
Because the Fifth Amendment says that
the Fifth Amendment says you have a due process right.
And it doesn't say only Americans are entitled to due process.
But what happens when you're a combatant and not a criminal? When you are in the process of waging war upon the United States.
Under the auspice of the drone strikes, anybody who's of military age is considered a combatant.
But that's the problem with the al-Awlaki argument, you know, what Anna was saying, and the lack of transparency, because the administration wasn't showing us anything as to whether or not he really was playing an operational role. As they said, mostly what we saw were just propagandistic videos that he was putting on the internet.
That he was putting it. Well,
yeah, but when
you're saying, hey,
you
I'm
can't
waging
go
war
say,
on the
I'm going
United
to kill
States,
somebody for something you said.
And then drop a Hellfire missile on his truck and take him and his buddies out.
Why is it that we've moved away from real justice and diplomacy in this country, and we focused on, we don't like that guy, so we're going to try to kill him. And in the process of trying to kill him, we might kill 14 other women and children.
Because we start talking about torture during the Bush administration and the legal mess that they created.
I'll tell you why we moved away from it. It's because they moved away. They moved into safe areas in Pakistan, safe areas in Yemen. And if we could go in and grab them, I'd be all for it. It's more useful to have them alive. However, we cannot arbitrarily allow them to go, okay, time out, I'm in the free zone, can't touch me, blah. No, no. You wage war in the United States, you're going to die. The people helping you, they're going to die too. And if people want to hang around you, they're going to die too. This is a tough world. War hasn't changed in thousands of years. You find your enemy, you kill him. That's how it works.
I think that they're waging war on the United States because we've waged a war on them, so our private contractors and our weapons manufacturers can become tremendously and fabulously wealthy as a result.
There were no private contractors back in the 7th century when radical Islam began its struggle against the West.
So you're denying that we invade countries for economic gain?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
I disagree with that.
You know, I spent a whole 6 months in Desert Storm. I never saw a freaking oil can. You know, I never saw an oil well. I never saw an oil barrel. I saw a lot of people from Kuwait, though, whose friends and family had been murdered when Saddam Hussein went in there. I saw a lot of people who wanted their homes back. That's what I saw.
So, Cameron, final question in this segment goes to you because I'm really curious about your experience when you did 2 tours in Iraq. What was it that made you become an anti-war veteran?
Well, you know, there was a major shift change that went on between my first deployment over there was part of the invasionary force when we first entered Iraq, and then my second tour over there was during the first Battle of Fallujah, and I just personally saw a major shift in the reaction and our relationship with Iraqis and Iraqi civilians. We were absolutely greeted as a liberating force when we went in there initially, and I think that's because people saw us as this unit that was coming in. We were going to remove Saddam Hussein. Once we did that, we were gone and we'd leave them to their devices, and that's exactly not what happened. And going over the second time, it was very obvious that we were an occupying force, and so questions started to come up for me as why are we still occupying this country? And you know, when I was in the Marine Corps, I didn't have access to, or really didn't even care to educate myself on what was going on outside of the military and our strategy and our policies. But when I became a civilian and I did more of the research on it, then what sort of turned me to it was my research that I did that pointed out to more of these economic reasons, and it came out that the weapons of mass destruction thing was falsified, and you know, these sort of all just piled on, and you look at our foreign policy, and the way that we go around and we sort of bully everybody into doing things our way. It isn't a good policy, and using tactics of military and strong-arming people isn't a way to build communities or coalitions or anything. I mean, we don't do things to promote peace abroad. Our humanitarian efforts pale in comparison to what we do militarily. I mean, we spend more than 50% of our budget on our military, and it's not in a defensive posture. We're not sitting on our shores and protecting our country. We're out invading countries and starting wars and getting involved in conflicts.
It's just really interesting to see two different perspectives from two individuals who have been at war. You know, I really appreciate the different perspectives. I know we disagree, but I think it's important for you to share your perspective, and same with you, Cameron, and Ilona as well. Even though you haven't, even though you've never been at war.
The peace stick and the girl over here. Yeah, I have not fought in battle.
All right. Well, we got to take a quick break. Let's do that. When we come back, Zero Dark 30 had a lot of controversy surrounding that, so we'll talk about that and torture. Welcome back to The Point. For our last point, we usually like to do something light and fun. So for this segment, we're going to talk about torture. It's going to be great.
Yeah.
Now, whenever it comes to U.S. Foreign policy, obviously it's a pretty heavy topic. But we do want to discuss Zero Dark 30 a little bit. And to submit a point on that, we have Huffpost Live's Mark Lamont Hill. Let's hear what he has to say.
Let's talk about laws that are getting broken internationally. This question of torture.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
And when this movie Zero Dark 30 comes out, most of us on the left, myself included, said this movie is problematic because it endorses torture. Mm-hmm. It makes it seem as if bin Laden doesn't get caught and killed without information gained from torture. Mm-hmm. That's the general sentiment from the left.
You watched the movie?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I understand a lot of people on the left, either they have seen it or haven't seen it, but they believe that the movie endorses torture. That's not how I saw it when I walked out of there. I mean, when I walked out of there, I thought, well, this movie makes an incredible statement against torture on so many levels. But here's where liberals go wrong. That just the way you posed it, in terms of, you know, it shows that torture works, right? That shouldn't be the question. It doesn't matter whether it works or doesn't work. I don't want to have that debate, because it's wrong. Torture is wrong. Torture is morally wrong. And the movie does an excellent job of showing the abject brutality of people working for you and I, paid for with your tax dollars and mine, doing these incredible things to people that may or may not be guilty. And even if they are guilty, you're not supposed to do this anyways.
All right. I love how I gave credit to Lamont Hill there, but I totally forgot to mention that Michael Moore was also in that video, making the real point. Cameron, let's start with you. What do you think about this whole question of Zero Dark 30 promoting torture? Have you seen the movie, and do you think that it does?
I have. I watched the torture scenes. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think that the movie promotes torture. And I think Michael Moore made a good point that that's not, the question isn't whether it works or not, the question is the morality of it, and should we be doing that, and should we be treating other world citizens in such a way. And a lot of people bring up the argument of the greater good, and I don't necessarily believe in the greater good argument. I think it becomes really a gray area when you start speaking in sort of these scenarios and hypotheticals, and I personally don't think that the movie necessarily promoted torture. But I don't necessarily agree also with Michael Moore making the point that it was sort of the opposite of that. I think somebody watching that movie thinks, oh, this worked and this is how things work. That video, that when Michael was speaking in that interview, he also brought up a good point that when torture does work, sometimes we get falsified information. So, like he said, you torture 100 people, 99 of those people are lying when they give you information, and one of the guys is, well, how do you decipher which one is the real information? So, I don't think it's necessarily a policy that's effective either.
So we'll talk about how effective it is in just a second, but I like the whole moral question of torture and whether or not it's the right thing to do internationally. And I get a feeling that Curt is probably okay with enhanced interrogations and waterboarding. I could be wrong, but Curt.
Yeah, like a torture. Just saying.
Well, the idea that there's any rational human being out there who wants to inflict pain on anyone else for any purpose and derive any pleasure out of it is completely alien to anything that the United States is about. And the United States' policy right now is crystal clear. We do not torture, and we do not allow it.
You don't think waterboarding is torture?
You know, there are a lot. I think at the very least, it's a very, very tough, hostile, painful act. Whether it becomes, whether it's really torture or not, really isn't the issue. I think Michael Moore, God help me, was correct in saying that it becomes a moral issue. And I think the movie serves an important purpose for showing what's happening in our name. It happened in our name as the United States. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal, that happened in our name. And that's something we need to look at. And that's why I'm for discussing. I'm for discussing drones. I'm for discussing what our people do in the military. It is important that, to the extent we possibly can be, I mean, rare instances when things have to be secret, but I think that we need to discuss it and look at it, and we need to ask the American people. First question, is this something you can live with? Now, they elected Barack Obama twice.
Yes.
Over my strong objections.
I didn't see that coming.
Hard to believe, huh? However, Barack Obama was crystal clear about his position on those techniques. And he says no. And that's a policy in the United States, and that's the one the American people supported. I'm not really sure what Mitt Romney's position was, and I don't know if it came up among the war on women and the rest of the things. Do we as a society want to do these things for the purposes that we've discussed? Maybe they help us get a guy like bin Laden, maybe they don't. I'm not really sure. I don't think any of us really know. I don't think any of us ever really will know. But that's something we certainly have to look at.
So what are your thoughts? Are you in favor of enhanced interrogation?
I don't know if you would call me in favor, but I'm not going to lose any sleep at night over what happened to those SOBs. I'm just not. I don't think it. I don't just think it destroys the moral standing of our country. However, if our country never ever does something like that again, I will be more than happy. No one wants to use tactics like that. No one wants to use techniques like that. That's not what our country's about in a very real way. At some point, could somebody construct one of the hypotheticals you were talking about that's so convoluted that makes those things necessary? I suppose somebody could. I'm a lawyer. I construct hypotheticals all the time. I could probably figure out one where 1 million children are in danger of being blown up by an A-bomb if we don't waterboard that guy, and then maybe I'd say waterboard the hell out of him. As an everyday practice, as something that's commonly done, as something that is a default go-to tactic, absolutely not. And our government right now is absolutely clear. We don't do that, at least not anymore.
Ilona?
The sad thing to me about that, you know, and you point out that public opinion chose the guy that said, we don't torture, I reject the policies of the previous administration, and yet what happened, right? We saw that the Obama administration, they just transferred the guy at the State Department that was supposed to be in charge of closing down Guantanamo Bay, and they're not even replacing him because they've just totally given up on that. We have pretrial hearings going on at Gitmo right now, and there's massive censorship involved. There are all these legal questions as to whether or not we're actually going to hear testimony as to what happened to these men that we did torture. We want it to be out of sight, out of mind, and the most disgusting example to me is what the government has done with John Kiriakou, who's the former CIA officer who just last Friday was sentenced to 30 months in prison. I'm very excited to be interviewing him tonight on Huffpost Live, and he's the only one that has really had to face any repercussions for the torture program, and the only one that has been held accountable, and accountable for what? For being the guy that blew the whistle on it, and for handing over a name of a CIA operative that didn't even come out to a reporter. This is no Valerie Plame case. So it's sure we can say that our government has a clear stance on it, but do they really? They don't actually want to have to deal with it. They don't want to have to go back and deal with what we did. And that to me is part of the problem with the movie as well. Whether or not you want to say that it promotes torture, it doesn't clarify anything. I think that it's assuming that most Americans know a lot more than they really do about the war on terror and about what happened. It's by no means a comprehensive assessment of the last 11 years, just jam-packed into one movie, you know, and so just by having these three different parts where we have the guy torturing, you have, you know, the woman trying to find the intelligence to get the driver and the courier, excuse me, and to get his phone number, and then like the 45 minutes that go on of the raid within the film, there is no breakdown or explanation that the waterboarding didn't in fact lead us to helping find bin Laden. And like you said, maybe we'll never know the full truth, but if we're just judging by what's coming out of the Senate Intelligence Committee, from Dianne Feinstein, the reports that they've pieced together, there is no proof of that any waterboarding or enhanced interrogation really did lead to good information, good intelligence that helped us get him. And I've interviewed a lot of people too that are former people that used to interrogate, you know, suspects, and they've said that they don't think that it works. They've said that there's no guarantee that you're going to get good information there.
Now, when it comes to questions of like indefinite detention and torture, I mean, if you think back 10 years ago, it was a really, really big deal. But now I feel like it's something that not only the media kind of ignores and doesn't really talk about very much, especially when it comes to civil liberties violations and things like that. But I'm really curious to see what you guys think about the Obama administration refusing to press any charges against Dick Cheney and Bush for using this enhanced interrogation and doing the torture. I mean, do you think that that set a precedent, and do you think that from this point forward we're going to see a much more relaxed view of torture?
Well, I mean, I think you said it right there, that these things trickle down, and people that are lower on that totem pole are the people who end up having, when somebody is going to be held accountable, those are the people that are held accountable. And the same thing happened with Abu Ghraib. It was the lowest level enlisted men that ended up being the ones punished for that, knowing full well that those policies went higher up that ladder. And I think we have to hold people accountable, and that's one of the things that we don't do. And there's sort of like this buddy system between the politicians. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, whatever. They're sort of like, hey, don't worry about it. We'll if we need to pin it on somebody, it's going to be some lower level person, and that's who we'll hold accountable. So, I mean, and that just spirals out of control.
We don't hold you accountable unless you're like a poor black guy that has, you know, a dime bag of weed on you. Then we'll lock you up for life.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, Curt, did you want to say something?
Oh, geez. Yeah, the whole idea of going out and indicting people over what happened after 9/11, I think it's just, I think it's substantively ridiculous, but I think it's also procedurally flawed. First of all, the legal issues are not as crystal clear as many people who are very, very upset about this issue think. The second thing is a practical matter. The American people don't want to do it. The American people have essentially looked at this and said, this is in the past, we're done with it, we're going to move on. And I understand there are some people who are still angry about it and still want some form of retribution against the folks who were defending us in the wake of 9/11, and it just simply isn't going to happen, at least not in the manner that they're speaking of. As for indefinite detention in Guantanamo, I think that's a totally separate, different issue than what you're calling torture. I think it is much more along the law of war framework of interning people who have committed, who have been captured on the battlefield. Of course, there are legal combatants. We're trying to come up with procedures to process these guys. There are a lot of legal problems with that. As a lawyer, I appreciate all that, and I appreciate the due process stuff. But I don't see Guantanamo closing. I think we need a place to put bad people who've done bad things and will do bad things again. And I think, you know, stick them on Cuba.
But the problem is you can't just separate the two, because the reason that we have so many of these people in Guantanamo Bay, and they're still in Guantanamo, is because of the way that they were treated at CIA black site prisons, because of the tactics or interrogation you know, techniques that were used against them. And so this creates a problem for us legally as to what testimony you can use if something was said,
That's
right,
certainly-
while they were being tortured.
and
And so it's very easy to legally put them on this island, you know, try them in a military commission rather than in our justice system, which happens to work just fine, which has convicted many, many terrorists because it's just become too much of a legal mess.
Well, I'm not sure it's just fine for this particular situation. I'm not sure our civil criminal justice system is really well formed and well structured for dealing with the kind of guys like this.
So
We have actually convicted
about
hundreds of terrorist
military
suspects in our civil justice system, and it's been
lines.
around
Well,
for, I mean,
military tribunals
this is the
are
one
the
that's been around for hundreds of years and tried and tested rather than military
Well,
commissions.
no,
So why wouldn't it?
and that is not a bad point. I don't think you're crazy for saying it.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
However, it's not all that crystal clear, at least not to me.
All right. I'll let you have the last word.
I was just going to say a lot of the things that are going on in Guantanamo Bay, again, going back to the due process issues. We suspend habeas corpus, and when people aren't U.S. citizens, it's almost easier for U.S. citizens themselves to not want to pay attention to what's going on with them, to not care about their civil liberties being violated. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that this country by and large is sort of just like numb to that. And I don't know if it's a psychological issue. I don't know if it's just because they're not educated enough on it, but we need to go back to that, and we need to reevaluate that value system that we have and how we treat people that aren't U.S. citizens, whether they're combatants or not.
It's kind of incredible that Obama was a constitutional law professor, you know, who was campaigning.
I think that every day.
Who was campaigning on the importance of habeas corpus. Anyway, amazing
get me
stuff.
started,
I
yeah.
know. We could do an entire show on that alone.
That'd be one of those agreement fests.
Yeah, that's true. All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank our awesome panelists for joining us for this great discussion today. Cameron White, Curt Schlichter,
Thank you.
and Alyona Minkovski. Thank you so much for joining us. Cameron, is there anything that you'd like to plug?
The National Veterans Foundation is an organization that I work for that helps vets. Our website's nvf.org. Check it out if you're a veteran or you know a veteran that needs access to resources.
All right, Curt.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on it. This has been an exciting debate.
Definitely.
And I'm glad I had a chance to bring in a conservative view. And if you want more of the conservative view, you can go find my Twitter account, Curt Schlichter, KurtSchlichter, where I'm constantly on there, because apparently I have no other life. And look for me at the Breitbart and townhall.com sites.
And Ilona?
It has been a spirited discussion and a very fun one. But what am I going to plug? Huffpost Live. You know, go check it out and what we're doing over there. You can follow me on Twitter. Like I said, I'm going to interview John Kiriakou today, get his take on how he feels about what the government has done to him. So make sure to watch that interview as well.
Excellent. And of course, thank you to our point contributors, Ed Krayewski from Reason Magazine, which you could check out at reason.com, Chase Madar, who is the author of The Passion of Bradley Manning, and of course, our point contribution from HuffPost Live. Make sure you guys check that out as well. I'm Anna Kasparian. You can watch me on Current TV and also on the Young Turks online at youtube.com/TYT Live. And please share your comments, share your thoughts. We always love interaction from our audience. And we'll see you guys next week with another episode of The Point. We're going to talk about parenting, and we're going to talk about whether or not it makes sense to reproduce. It'll be a great discussion. So we'll see you soon.